Welcome to the One SJI Diversity and Inclusion podcast, where we discuss topics and trends in diversity and inclusion here at SJI. Diversity and inclusion accommodations are making their rounds in organizations. And by now, most organizations are aware that talent is not limited to race, gender, age, physical ability, sexual orientation, or social class. Unfortunately, most workplaces have not figured out how to include or have the conversation on neurodivergent people in that listing. When we look at studies done by the Institute of Leadership and Management, about half of all business leaders and managers surveyed were unwilling to hire workers with neurodivergent conditions. This month's podcast will be speaking about neurodiversity. When it comes to skilled trade industries, only 26% of neurodivergent workers are willing to openly reveal that they have a diagnosis. This month with us, we have Director of Talent Acquisition, Allison Sharias, who will be sharing on her experience professionally, as well as how we can continue to develop our workforce when it comes to including neurodiversity in the conversations around neurodivergent conditions. Welcome, Allison, to the One SJI podcast. Allison, please introduce yourself and tell us what you do here at SJI and how you became a neurodivergent advocate.
Sure. And thank you for having me. I am the head of talent acquisition here at SJI. So I lead our recruitment teams as well as our talent acquisition operations team.
I'm super excited about this because neurodiversity is not something that corporate companies talk about from a professional standpoint. So, before we get into the meat and potatoes of this, can you tell us a little bit about what neurodiversity is?
Sure. I mean, neurodiversity, if you go to Wikipedia, it'll give you some textbook answer, but from a real perspective, what neurodiversity is really just a different way of thinking
Mhm.
about things, right? Some people call it a disability. If you look at an application, a lot of times they'll be like, "Do you have a disability?" And it'll name a handful of neurodiverse conditions. And I hate to really think about it that way. It's not a disability. I think it's
Right.
actually, I tell my kids it's a superpower. So it's just a different way of thinking of things, a different perspective.
Right. And when we talk about diversity, variations matter, and a lot of times we don't think about the fact that all of us have human brain processing in different ways, right? The ways that we are social with each other, the ways that we pay attention, the ways that we learn, and how our moods are different. And I think historically, being different in certain spaces has been polarizing, particularly in professional spaces where you're expected to look like everybody else, think like everybody else, respond like everybody else. But neurodiversity as an advocacy point really creates this conversation that difference is important. And it's not a disability, right? It is not something that's debilitating. It is very powerful. And if we lean into the fact that it's very powerful, we can empower our workforce, and younger professionals coming into our workforce to be themselves unapologetically. So I appreciate you sharing that.
I really became passionate about this actually personally, right? So I've got two children who have ADHD and they're teenagers, they're in high school now, and have been working with them and working with their teachers on just really the best way that they learn and how they can be successful, not only in school but after school as well. And then at a previous company, it was great. I had an opportunity to work with a specific company that managed other companies, managed managers, managed training of neurodiverse employees. And I learned so much from this company that it just became a passion of mine. I learned all of the great things that people with neurodiversity situations or people on the spectrum, so many more things that I ever have before on what they can accomplish and what they can do and how they think and how they work and where they can best fit into a corporate company.
So, what are some of the common misconceptions about neurodiversity?
I think some of the big ones are that, it's a mental health issue,
Mhm.
um, that it's a learning disability, even in our school system. If a child has, let's say, ADHD, it's considered a learning disability. And again, I cringe when I hear that because it's not a learning disability as much as it's a learning difference. So, I think that that's a misperception. But in the workplace too, managers are like, "Oh, I'm going to have to manage this person differently. I'm going to have to give them so much more oversight. It's going to be difficult. They're not going to get it as quickly." Those type of misconceptions, and they're just simply not true.
I will tell you very transparently a story of my own. I sat in a PhD class with about 12 students. There was this brilliant young lady, her name was Rachel. And Rachel, for me, smashed the box. I mean, when it came to, and we were doing statistics, and statistics is very difficult. Rachel would rattle off those responses like nobody's business. And I learned at the end of the class that Rachel actually she had Asperger's, which is a part of a spectrum on the autism spectrum, a disorder on the autism spectrum. She was brilliant, super, super brilliant. She began to explain to me her challenges where it came to her social aptitude and how. She could retain information wonderfully, but when it came to interacting with others, that's where her challenge showed up. And she felt this responsibility to kind of prove herself, which is why she pushed herself so hard academically because socially that was not her genius, and that leads us into the difference that we all bring to the table. We all have different kinds of geniuses. So I think that there's tons of misconceptions about neurodivergent folk having learning delays or having certain inabilities to perform their jobs. But the truth of the matter is, we're all great at something and we're all not so great at something.
If you find a position, if someone, like in the case of your classmate, if you find a position that interests you and you're on that scale, right? That's where you're gonna fly, right? You're gonna succeed. We hear this a lot, is that, again, bringing it back to ADHD, right? So kids can, focus on, something like a video game for hours and hours and hours and hours,
Mm, mhm,
or they can hyper focus on something, right? That's their power, is that as long as they're interested in it, they can deliver ridiculous results in a short period of time because they hyper focus on it. We think of ADHD as a focus problem, but it's really just, we need to be able to filter what that person is focusing on. Sometimes people with ADHD, or even Asperger's, they'll be more focused on the task at hand
mhm,
than a non-neurodiverse person.
correct.
Absolutely could be very much an asset to any
Yeah.
company.
And that moves us into our next question or thought. How do neurodivergent employees improve our workforce? So, whether we know it or not, studies show that about half of our workforce actually identifies as neurodiverse but do not disclose their identity because of the misconceptions or stereotypes about neurodivergent workers. What are some things that we can do here at SJI to improve and welcome the human nature of our difference?
No, absolutely. There's still this stigma around it. And I think companies are starting to get better with the focus of diversity and inclusion in the past, handful of years or so. It is starting to improve, but I think empowering those employees to speak up if they're comfortable doing so, and letting others know, like, hey, I'm in the same boat as you. Right.
Mhm.
So I'm not ashamed to say it. I was diagnosed with ADHD too. My poor children, man, they didn't have a chance. Their father is ADHD, I'm ADHD. But to give you some insight, I was a straight A student all
Mhm.
throughout school. I was an A student through my college, my undergrad, and I went on to get a 3.9 in my master's program. And
Mm.
so I advocate. I'm very open about the fact, my senior, everybody on my team knows And we kind of make fun of it, not, jokingly. I make fun of myself a little bit, but I think it opens the door. Like, hey,
Uh,
it's okay. Look, I'm a director here. If a
yeah.
director can be open
Yeah.
about it, I'm letting other people say, it's okay. It's okay to
That's
to let other
awesome.
people know.
Yeah, that's awesome, Allison. Speaking of that, my question to you becomes what positive or negative experiences have you had just in being diagnosed as neurodivergent in your professional development? I mean, have you had challenges with navigating into a leadership space?
Yes, yes, I definitely have. Usually never around my performance. My performance has always been, as most people that are neurodiverse, has usually been on par or exceeds expectations. It was more around the communication piece. I'm very blunt, right? And sometimes I have to just kind of check myself, right? And know what audience I'm speaking to, and not necessarily change my personality,
Right.
right? Just change how I deliver the message that I want to deliver. And you know what? I've had a lot of help and support here at SJI around that. It's been great. And now, again, we kind of joke about it that, oh, Allison's making a face again. It's not, you know, we tend to make a lot of faces and sometimes say things before we necessarily think it all the way through. But again, I've been supported here, and I think that's helped. That's helped a lot in just tweaking my communication methods.
That is spectacular. I mean, I'm so happy to hear that, you've had positive experiences here, but and that speaks to the inclusivity here at SJI. I just know, sometimes when you're different to other people, people kind of question and assess your ability to lead. And here at SJI, people have leaned in to your difference and allowed you to do what you do well, and that speaks to your volume of leadership, as well as your ability to execute with excellence. So I want to say thank you for that. Before we wrap up, what are some best practices for individuals who are neurodivergent? How can we create a better pipeline in our organizations around access and inclusivity for neurodivergent folk?
Well, I think it actually starts with our current employees. We need to walk our talk, and the best source of candidates come from employee referrals. So if we have a neurodiverse employee already working with us, and most likely they're going to know other neurodiverse individuals, right? They can say, "Hey, it's not an issue at SJI. It's a great place to work if you do learn differently, or if you're a visual learner versus a audio learner, they support you in that, right? So do we have a lot more work to do? Yeah, absolutely. I think every company in this country does.
Mhm.
um, but I think it starts with our current employees and being able to advocate for SJI as a company that supports neurodiverse candidates. And then also, everything in the talent acquisition life cycle needs to be re-examined. Everything from the application, like how are we wording things? Are we wording it as, voluntarily disclosing your disability, or do we word it as something else, right? When we're doing orientation, is it fair to stick somebody with ADHD, say, into a all-day orientation that is strictly somebody just speaking at you? Probably not. When we're looking at training managers how to interview a neurodiverse candidate, right? So we like to do, sometimes we here at SJI we'll do panel interviews, but for some folks, it's really overwhelming,
Mhm.
right, to do a panel interview, and they can't be their best self or really show off their skills and what they can offer the company because they're too focused on the fact that there's multiple people staring at them. And if it's a job that doesn't require you to be in front of multiple people all the time, then that should be okay. We should be able to tweak the interview style. We need to start looking at also competency based interviewing. It's not just about necessarily what's on your resume, but what else can you bring to the table? A lot of folks with like especially folks on the autistic spectrum, on the autism spectrum, they won't apply for a job unless they actually meet every single one of the requirements.
Wow.
Right. So they just won't apply. They're like, "Oh, nope, I don't check this one. I'm not going to apply." Even if it says like a preferred versus a required, they won't apply. With that said, looking at again the application and how we're wording things and the job description, also to our interviewing, right? So if we're saying, "Oh, you're definitely going to be doing this," or "You must have this," in our interview, this is what we're looking for this person to already come in having, the person's going to give up. They're just going to shut down.
So, creating care culture, I believe this conversation has enlivened our ability to be open, to be authentic, to be expressive. And I think this conversation allows our employees to know that SJI cares about how to support them and how to create a positive and supportive environment to help to build a successful pipeline. I want to say thank you so very much for offering yourself this month to share in this conversation. This is not our last. I most certainly welcome continued conversation around what we can continue to do to improve our workforce and to create more access for neurodivergent folk. If people want to reach out to Allison, you can find her in our directory. If you have any other thoughts or questions around neurodiversity, please hit up Tiara Neal in Diversity and Inclusion. Thank you so very much for listening to the One SJI Diversity Podcast. All have a great and successful month.